On the Arizona frontier in 1869, a prisoner bound in ropes will witness a child swept into deadly rapids. In seconds, she must choose between her own survival and certain death. What happens next will shatter hatred and forge the most unlikely bond the Apache Nation has ever known. The rope burned against Kate Brennan's wrists as she stumbled through the rocky canyon, her boots sliding on loose shale with each forced step. The Apache warriors moved with practiced silence around her, their moccasins finding purchase where her settler shoes failed. 3 days had passed since the raid on the wagon train. 3 days since she'd watched her brother fall defending their supplies. 3 days since rough hands had bound her and dragged her into these unforgiving mountains. The sun hammered down without mercy, turning the canyon into an oven that baked the desperation deeper into her bones. Kate was 26 years old, a widow from Ohio who'd been traveling west with her younger brother, Thomas, to start fresh after the war had taken her husband at Shiloh. She had auburn hair now matted with dust and sweat, gray eyes that had once been called striking, but now reflected only exhaustion and fear, and hands that had known piano keys and embroidery needles, but were now raw and bleeding from the binding ropes. The lead warrior, a man with a scar running from his left eye to his jawline, had made it clear through gestures and broken English that she was to be traded or ransomed, kept alive only because her clothing suggested she might have wealthy family back east. The war party consisted of 7 men, all moving with the efficiency of those who'd spent lifetimes in these harsh lands. They spoke little, communicated mostly through hand signals and brief words in their own tongue that Kate couldn't understand. The scarred leader they called Stone Jaw, and he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Behind him rode a younger warrior with kind eyes who'd twice offered Kate water from his pouch when Stone Jaw wasn't looking. A small mercy that kept the spark of humanity alive in her chest, even as terror threatened to extinguish it. They'd been descending into a deeper canyon for the past hour, following a trail that seemed invisible to Kate's untrained eyes, but was apparently clear as a road to her captors. The sound of rushing water grew steadily louder, echoing off the red rock walls that rose hundreds of feet on either side. Kate's throat was parched despite the water she'd been given, her tongue thick and swollen from breathing dust and fear. She tried to remember prayers her mother had taught her as a child, but the words scattered like startled birds every time she attempted to grasp them. The canyon opened suddenly into a wider space where cottonwood trees provided blessed shade and a river churned through a series of rapids, white water foaming over black rocks that looked sharp as Apache arrowheads. On the far bank, Kate could see a small encampment of wickiups, the traditional Apache dwellings made of wooden frames covered with brush and hides. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and she could hear children's voices carried on the wind. A sound so normal and domestic, it seemed impossible in this place of her captivity. Stone Jaw called out in his language, a series of sharp syllables that carried across the water. Figures emerged from the wickiups, women mostly, with children clustering around their legs to stare at the approaching warriors and their prisoner. Kate felt dozens of eyes upon her, measuring her, judging her, seeing in her all the wrongs that white settlers had committed against their people. She tried to stand straighter despite her exhaustion, tried to meet those stares with dignity rather than the terror that clawed at her insides. The warriors guided their horses toward a shallow crossing upstream from the rapids, a place where the river spread wider and moved more slowly over a gravel bed. Kate's boots filled with icy water as they forded, the current strong enough to make her stagger, but not strong enough to sweep her away. Though the thought crossed her mind that drowning might be preferable to whatever fate awaited her in that Apache camp. On the far bank, Stone Jaw dismounted and gestured sharply for Kate to sit on a flat rock near the water's edge. She sat, grateful to be off her feet even as the rope binding her wrists bit deeper into swollen flesh. The camp was larger than it had appeared from across the river, perhaps 30 or 40 people in total. with children ranging from infants to adolescents moving between the wickiups. An elderly woman with silver hair and a face mapped with wrinkles approached, speaking rapidly to Stonejaw in their language while eyeing Kate with an expression that mixed curiosity with suspicion. Whatever was being discussed, Kate understood she was the subject. The old woman finally nodded and gestured for Kate to stand. With surprising strength for someone so aged, she gripped Kate's arm and led her toward one of the wickiups on the edge of camp, away from the central fire where most of the people gathered. Inside the shelter it was cooler, dim after the harsh sunlight, with a smell of sage and wood smoke and something medicinal Kate couldn't identify. The woman pushed Kate down onto a woven mat, then produced a knife that made Kate's heart leap into her throat. But instead of violence, the old woman simply cut the ropes binding Kate's wrists, muttering what might have been disgust at the damage the bonds had caused. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a clay bowl of water and some kind of plant paste that she applied to the rope burns with surprisingly gentle hands. Kate sat frozen, afraid that any movement might be misinterpreted as aggression or escape. The old woman met her eyes once, a long measuring look, then nodded slightly as if Kate had passed some tests she hadn't known she was taking. When the old woman left, she didn't rebind Kate's hands, but she did position herself at the wickiup entrance in a way that made it clear Kate was not to leave. Through the opening, Kate could see the river still rushing past, could hear the voices of children playing somewhere nearby, could smell meat cooking over fires and feel the weight of her situation pressing down like the mountains themselves. She was alone among people who had every reason to hate her, in a place she couldn't escape even if her hands were free, with no idea if she would see another sunrise or if this shelter would become her tomb. The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness. Kate dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally overcoming fear enough to let her eyes close. She dreamed of Thomas, of his laugh and his terrible jokes, and the way he'd promised their new life in California would make up for all the losses they'd endured. She dreamed of the moment the Apache warriors had come screaming out of the rocks, of the arrows that had found him, of his blood dark on the dusty ground. She woke with tears on her face and the old woman watching her with an expression that might have been pity. As evening approached, the sounds of the camp changed. The children's voices grew louder, excited about something. Kate heard splashing and laughter from the direction of the river. The old woman rose and gestured for Kate to follow, making it clear this wasn't a request. Kate stood on unsteady legs and walked out into the golden light of late afternoon, blinking at the brightness after the dimness of the wickiup near the river's edge. A group of children played in the shallows upstream from the rapids, splashing and diving under the watchful eyes of several women. Among them, Kate spotted a little girl of perhaps 8 years old, with long black hair that gleamed wet in the sunlight, and a laugh that carried clear as bells across the water. The child was braver than the others, venturing into slightly deeper water, diving beneath the surface and emerging with shouts of triumph. The old woman noticed Kate watching and spoke, gesturing toward the girl. Though Kate couldn't understand the words, something in the woman's tone suggested pride, perhaps even love. A granddaughter maybe, or a favored child of the tribe. The girl was clearly special to these people, clearly cherished in a way that made Kate's chest ache with memories of children she'd taught back in Ohio. Children who'd called her Miss Kate and brought her wildflowers and drawings. Kate was so focused on the children that she almost didn't notice when Stonejaw and 2 other warriors approached. They carried fresh ropes, and Stonejaw's expression was hard as the canyon walls. He barked something at the old woman, who argued back with surprising force for someone so aged, but ultimately the warrior's authority prevailed. He gestured curtly for Kate to put her hands forward. The rope was rough hemp, scratchy and thick, and Stonejaw bound her wrists with efficient movements that suggested long practice. He tied the knots tight enough to prevent escape, but not so tight as to cut off circulation, a small mercy Kate hadn't expected. When he finished, He looped the trailing end of the rope around a cottonwood tree near where they stood, effectively tethering Kate like a horse. She could sit, could stand, could move in perhaps a 6-foot radius, but couldn't wander or flee. Stone Jaw said something to the old woman that made her face darken with displeasure, but she nodded and returned to her position near Kate. The warrior strode away toward the central fire where other men were gathering, probably to discuss the prisoner's fate over their evening meal. Kate sank down at the base of the cottonwood tree, her back against its rough bark, and watched the children continue their play in the river. The little girl with the bright laugh had ventured even farther out now, to where the water deepened and the current grew stronger. Kate felt a flutter of unease watching her, recognizing the confidence of a child who didn't yet understand how quickly water could turn from friend to enemy. The women watching from the bank called out warnings that the girl ignored, too caught up in her game to heed their caution. What happened next occurred with terrible speed. The girl dove under the water showing off, but when she surfaced she drifted closer to where the river narrowed and accelerated toward the rapids. Kate saw the moment the child realized her danger, saw the laugh transform into panic as the current grabbed her with inexorable force. The girl's arms flailed, her mouth opened in a scream that was drowned by the roar of rushing water. The women on the bank shrieked and began running downstream along the rocky shore. But the current was faster than any human could run. Other children scrambled out of the water, their play turning to terror as they watched their friends swept toward the churning rapids, where rocks waited like teeth to smash anything the river carried into them. Kate saw men running from the camp, saw Stone Jaw sprinting toward the water with other warriors behind him. But they were too far away, too slow. The girl was already being pulled into the white water. Kate's hands moved without conscious thought. Her fingers found the knots at her wrists, worked at them with desperate strength, born of pure instinct. The rope was tight, but Stone Jaw had tied it for security, not impossibility, and Kate's smaller hands found enough space to twist and pull. The old woman shouted something, tried to grab at Kate, but Kate was already moving, the rope falling away from her wrists as the final knot gave way. She ran toward the water, her boots pounding on the rocky ground, her lungs burning with effort. She could hear shouting behind her, could hear the old woman's voice raised in alarm, could hear Stone Jaw bellowing what were surely orders to stop the escaping prisoner. But Kate's eyes were locked on the small dark head, now visible only in flashes between waves, on the little arms still struggling but growing weaker with each second. Kate hit the water at a full run, the cold shocking her system like a physical blow. The current immediately tried to sweep her downstream, but she angled her body against it. Swimming hard with strokes her father had taught her in the river back in Ohio. She'd been a strong swimmer as a girl, had spent summers diving for stones and racing her brothers. And muscle memory took over now as her arms pulled through the water. The girl was just ahead, being tumbled in the current like a rag doll. Kate pushed harder, her waterlogged dress dragging at her like hands trying to pull her under. The roar of the rapids grew louder, closer, death waiting in those churning rocks. Kate's fingers brushed fabric, lost it, lunged forward and grabbed again. This time she caught the girl's dress and held on. Pulling the child against her chest, the girl coughed and choked, her dark eyes wide with terror and her small hands clutching at Kate with desperate strength. Kate wrapped one arm around the child and used the other to fight the current, trying to angle them toward the bank. But the river was too strong, too fast, and they were being pulled inexorably toward the rapids. Kate could see the rocks now, could see the white water exploding over them, could feel death reaching up from the churning foam. Then hands grabbed her, strong hands closing around her free arm. Kate looked up through water-blurred vision to see the young warrior with kind eyes, the one who'd given her water on the trail, had waded chest-deep into the current at great risk to himself. He was shouting something, pulling at her, and Kate understood she needed to let him help. Together they fought the river, The warrior's strength combined with Kate's swimming, finally proving enough to move them out of the main current. Other hands reached out as they neared the bank. The women who'd been watching the children were there, pulling the little girl from Kate's arms, pulling Kate herself onto the rocky shore where she collapsed gasping and shaking. The girl was coughing up water but breathing, alive, her dark eyes no longer panicked but shocked and grateful. The woman who took her, probably the child's mother, was crying and speaking rapidly, clutching the girl against her chest. Kate lay on the rocks feeling the world spin around her, her lungs burning and her muscles trembling with exhaustion. She became aware of voices raised in what sounded like argument, looked up to see Stone Jaw standing over her with an expression she couldn't read. The young warrior who'd helped was there too, speaking rapidly and gesturing between Kate and the child. The old woman from the wickiup had appeared, adding her voice to whatever debate was taking place. Then a new voice cut through the argument, commanding and deep. Kate turned her head to see a man approaching, clearly someone of importance from the way the others fell silent. He was perhaps 40 years old, tall and lean with silver streaking his black hair and eyes that seemed to see through to the bone. He looked at the little girl, now wrapped in blankets and still coughing. Then at Kate still lying soaked and shivering on the rocks. Then at Stone Jaw, the important man spoke, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. Stone Jaw responded, gesturing at Kate with what seemed like anger or frustration. The young warrior spoke next, his tone respectful but insistent. The old woman added something brief but emphatic. Finally the important man nodded once, decisively, and spoke a single word that seemed to settle the matter. Two women approached Kate with blankets, helping her to sit up and wrapping the warm fabric around her shoulders. The little girl broke away from her mother and came to Kate, her small hand reaching out to touch Kate's face with a gentleness that brought tears to Kate's eyes. The child spoke in her own language, words Kate couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear in the tone, in the gratitude shining from those dark eyes. The important man stepped forward and spoke to Kate directly. Though she couldn't understand his words, she heard something in his voice that wasn't hatred or threat. He gestured to the girl, to Kate, to the river. And though Kate didn't know what he was saying, she understood that something fundamental had changed in that moment when she jumped into the rapids. As the sun touched the canyon rim and shadows lengthened across the Apache camp, Kate sat wrapped in blankets by the river's edge, no longer bound, no longer guarded as a prisoner, but watched now with a different kind of attention. The little girl whose life she'd saved sat beside her, small and warm against her side, and Kate felt the weight of what had just happened settling over her like the blankets themselves. She'd acted on pure instinct to save a child, and in doing so had somehow crossed an invisible line between prisoner and something else. Something she didn't yet have a name for. The firelight painted dancing shadows across the circle of faces as Kate sat among the Apache people for the first time. Not as a prisoner, but as something uncertain and new. 2 days had passed since she'd pulled Morning Dove from the rapids. 2 days during which the camp had watched her with eyes that held curiosity instead of contempt. The rope burns on her wrists were healing under poultices the old woman applied each morning. The same grandmother who Kate now knew was called White Rain and who had claimed some responsibility for Kate's presence in the camp. Morning Dove had barely left Kate's side since the rescue, trailing after her like a devoted shadow despite her mother's attempts to give the white woman space. The child would sit near Kate's wickiup in the mornings, watching with fascinated eyes as Kate tried to rebraid her auburn hair or attempted to repair her tattered dress with a bone needle White Rain had provided. The girl would bring Kate things, small offerings that spoke of a child's gratitude. A smooth river stone, a handful of sweet berries, a feather from a red-tailed hawk. Kate had learned that the important man who'd spoken with such authority after the rescue was Chief Gray Thunder, leader of this band and Morning Dove's father. His wife had died 2 winters past from the white man's spotted sickness, leaving him to raise his daughter alone with help from White Rain, who was his mother. The chief carried his grief quietly, but Kate saw it in the way his eyes softened when Morning Dove laughed, in how his hand would rest on the child's head, as if reassuring himself she was real and alive. The young warrior who'd helped pull them from the river was called Running Fox, and Kate learned he was Stonejaw's nephew despite their vastly different temperaments. Where Stonejaw viewed Kate with continued suspicion, tempered only by grudging acknowledgement of her deed, Running Fox had appointed himself an unofficial protector, ensuring she received adequate food and wasn't harassed by those in camp who still saw her as an enemy. He spoke a handful of English words learned from traders and missionaries, enough to establish the beginnings of communication. On the 3rd morning after the rescue, White Rain appeared at Kate's wickiup with a bundle of clothing. Traditional Apache dress made of deerskin and decorated with small blue beads. The old woman gestured at Kate's ruined settler clothes with clear disapproval, making it plain that Kate was expected to change. Kate understood this wasn't merely about practicality, but about transformation, about beginning to blur the lines between her world and theirs. The deerskin dress was softer than Kate expected, worn smooth by whoever had owned it before, probably White Rain herself in younger days. It fit reasonably well, though loose in places where Kate's frame didn't match its original owner. When she emerged from the wickiup wearing it, she found Morning Dove waiting with a smile that could light the darkest canyon. The girl clapped her hands and spoke rapidly, clearly pleased with Kate's transformation. White Rain nodded with satisfaction and gestured for Kate to follow. They walked through the camp to where several women were working on various tasks, scraping hides, weaving baskets, grinding seeds and roots with stone tools. The women looked up as Kate approached, their expressions ranging from welcoming to wary. White Rain spoke firmly in Apache, her tone brooking no argument. And one by one the women made space for Kate to sit among them. A woman named Deertrack, who had kind eyes and quick hands, showed Kate how to properly scrape a deer hide. The angle to hold the tool, the amount of pressure to apply, the rhythm that made the work easier on the arms and back. Kate's first attempts were clumsy, earning patient corrections and a few stifled laughs, but no mockery. These women understood that skills took time to develop, that Kate was trying to spy her foreign ways. Morning Dove sat nearby, ostensibly watching her grandmother work on a basket, but actually spending most of her time studying Kate with an intensity that would have been unnerving if it weren't so clearly born of childish fascination. During a break when the women passed around a water gourd, the girl scooted closer to Kate and pointed at her auburn hair, speaking in Apache with a questioning tone. Running Fox happened to be passing and paused to translate, his English halting but comprehensible. She asks why your hair holds fire color. She thinks maybe you touched by sun spirit. Kate smiled at the poetic interpretation and touched her own hair, then gently touched Morning Dove's black braids. All people look different, she said slowly, hoping Running Fox could translate. Where I come from, many have hair this color. Running Fox conveyed this to Morning Dove, who listened with rapt attention, then reached out to touch Kate's hair with gentle curiosity. The other women watched this exchange with interest, and Kate sensed something shifting in how they perceived her. She wasn't just a white prisoner anymore. She was becoming a person with her own story, her own mysteries. That afternoon, Chief Grey Thunder summoned Kate to his wickiup. Stonejaw stood nearby as a witness, his scarred face neutral but his eyes sharp. The chief spoke in Apache, his voice measured and deliberate, while Running Fox translated. Grey Thunder says you saved his daughter when warriors could not reach her. He says this debt weighs heavy, must be answered. He asks what you want from Apache people. Kate considered carefully before responding, understanding this was a pivotal moment. I want to live, she said simply. I want to not be killed or traded like a horse. I want to be treated as a person, not an enemy, Running Fox translated, and Gray Thunder listened with his dark eyes fixed on Kate's face. When the translation finished, the chief nodded slowly and spoke again. He says you acted with courage, saved his daughter at risk to yourself when you could have let River take her and maybe use confusion to escape. He says this shows good heart. You will not be traded or harmed. You will live among the people, learn our ways. If you try to escape, you will be hunted and brought back or killed. If you stay and honor this agreement, you will be protected as one of us. Running Fox translated, it wasn't freedom. Not in the way Kate had dreamed of during her first days of captivity. But it was a kind of reprieve, a chance at life that many captives never received. She nodded her acceptance, understanding that her fate was now bound to this Apache band in ways both terrifying and strangely hopeful. Gray Thunder made a gesture of dismissal, and Stone Jaw escorted Kate back to her wickiup with his usual silence. As spring deepened into early summer, Kate found herself settling into rhythms she never could have imagined. Her days began with White Rain's arrival at dawn, the old woman bringing food and checking the healing of Kate's various injuries with practiced efficiency. Morning Dove would appear shortly after, eager to begin what had become an informal exchange of knowledge. Kate teaching her English words while the girl taught Kate Apache language and customs. The child was a quick and enthusiastic student, picking up English phrases with the ease of youth. Kate would point to objects around camp and name them in English, while Morning Dove would provide the Apache words. Tree, river, sky, fire, each word building bridges between their worlds. Morning Dove delighted especially in learning the names of animals, practicing the English sounds with exaggerated care that made Kate laugh. In turn, Kate absorbed Apache language with desperate focus, understanding that communication meant survival and eventual acceptance. The language was complex, with sounds her English-trained mouth struggled to form, but White Rain proved a patient if demanding teacher. The old woman would repeat words until Kate's pronunciation satisfied her, praising success with rare smiles and correcting failures with sharp clicks of her tongue. Kate learned that the Apache lived by codes she was only beginning to understand. Concepts of honor and obligation, of reciprocity and respect, of the sacred relationship between people and the land that sustained them. She learned that Morning Dove's name came from her habit as an infant of cooing like doves in the cottonwood trees. That White Rain had once been a warrior woman who fought beside her husband before age slowed her body. That Running Fox earned his name by outrunning a cavalry patrol when he was just 14. She learned too about the tensions and dangers that shaped Apache life. The white settlers pushing ever westward brought disease and destruction, claiming lands the Apache had hunted for generations. The U.S. Army built forts and sent patrols to restrict Apache movements, to force them onto reservations where promised supplies rarely came and promised protections proved hollow. Every hunting party that left camp carried the risk of ambush. Every encounter with white travelers held potential for violence. One evening as Kate helped the women prepare the evening meal, grinding mesquite beans into flour with a stone pestle, a hunting party returned with troubling news. Stone Jaw and 5 other warriors had encountered a wagon train 2 days' ride to the south, settlers heading toward the new fort being built near Copper Canyon. The warriors had watched from hiding, counting armed men and noting the heavy weapons being transported. Gray Thunder called a council that night, and Kate was surprised to find herself included among those gathered around the central fire. The chief spoke gravely, his words translated quietly for Kate by Running Fox who sat behind her. The settlers were coming in greater numbers, the chief said, claiming lands around the best water sources, cutting down sacred trees for their buildings, driving away game with their noise and their herds. An older warrior whose face bore the scars of many battles argued for war, for striking the wagon trains before they could reach the fort, for making the cost of settlement too high for the white invaders to bear. Others counseled caution, pointing out that for every wagon train destroyed, the army would send more soldiers, better armed and seeking revenge. The debate went back and forth, passionate voices rising in the firelight. Gray Thunder finally raised his hand for silence and spoke with calm authority. He acknowledged both positions, the need to defend their lands and the danger of provoking overwhelming retaliation. Then he did something unexpected. He asked Kate to speak, to tell them what she knew of the white settlers' intentions and numbers. Kate felt every eye turn toward her, felt the weight of suspicion from those who still saw her as the enemy despite the rescue of Morning Dove. She stood slowly, her heart hammering, and spoke in her halting Apache supplemented by Running Fox's translation. "I do not speak for all white people," she began.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
"But I know that they come because they have lost much in the war between the states. They seek new land, new beginning. They do not see that this land belongs to you. They see only empty space to be claimed," she continued, explaining what she knew of government policies encouraging westward settlement, of the railroad companies being granted vast landholdings, of the Army's mandate to clear the frontier for white expansion. She didn't soften the truth, didn't try to justify what her people were doing, simply laid out the reality as she understood it. When she finished, silence hung over the council fire. Stonejaw spoke then, his voice hard as flint. He addressed Kate directly, asking through Running Fox's translation why she thought they should trust anything she said, whether she might not be trying to mislead them to help her own people. It was a fair question, and Kate met his scarred face with steady eyes. "I have no people now," she said quietly. "My brother is dead. My husband died in the war. My parents are buried in Ohio. The wagon train I traveled with left me behind when the raid came. I am here, wearing your clothes, eating your food, learning your language. I tell you truth because lies would serve no purpose. The settlers will come whether you believe me or not. The only question is whether you can find a way to survive what is coming." Her words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Gray Thunder studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly and spoke. Running Fox translated. "He says you speak with honest tongue even when truth is hard. He says this is mark of wisdom. The council will consider what you have told us." The gathering broke up shortly after, people drifting back to their wickiups in thoughtful silence. Morning Dove found Kate as she walked back to her shelter, the girl slipping her small hand into Kate's larger one. The child spoke in her mixture of Apache and broken English, asking if Kate was scared. Kate squeezed the small hand gently and answered honestly, "Yes, little one, I am scared. But being scared doesn't mean giving up. It means being careful and smart." The girl seemed to accept this wisdom with a solemn nod. That night, Kate lay awake in her wickiup listening to the sounds of the sleeping camp. The crackling of dying fires, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves. She thought about the council, about the impossible position the Apache found themselves in, caught between their traditional ways and the unstoppable tide of white settlement. She thought about her own transformation from prisoner to something almost like a member of this community. The next morning brought a surprise. Gray Thunder announced that the band would be moving to their summer grounds in the higher elevations, where game was more plentiful and the heat less oppressive. The entire camp erupted into organized activity, wickiups being dismantled, possessions being packed, horses being readied for the journey. White Rain directed Kate to help with packing, showing her how to secure loads on travois poles that would be dragged by horses. Morning Dove was everywhere at once, excited by the prospect of travel, chattering about the summer camp in the mountains, where there were streams full of fish and meadows thick with flowers. The girl's enthusiasm was infectious, and Kate found herself caught up in the energy of preparation, despite knowing that the move would take her even farther from the world she'd known. By midday, the band was ready to depart, a procession of people and horses winding out of the canyon camp that had been Kate's home for the past weeks. She rode a gentle mare that White Rain had assigned to her, with Morning Dove often riding close beside her on her own small pony. The girl kept up a running commentary in her mixed language, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about previous journeys. As they climbed into the mountains, Kate found herself struck by the austere beauty of this land. The red rocks giving way to pine forests, the air growing cooler and sweeter with altitude. She understood why the Apache fought so fiercely to keep these lands, understood the sacred connection they felt to mountains and rivers and endless sky. This wasn't just territory to be defended. It was home in the deepest sense, the place that held their stories and their spirits. On the second day of travel, Running Fox rode up beside Kate during a rest stop. He'd been scouting ahead with other warriors but had returned with something to show her. From his pouch he pulled a small book, water-stained and worn, that he'd found abandoned near an old campsite. It was a primer, the kind used to teach children to read, and he asked Kate if she would teach him his letters. Kate took the book with hands that trembled slightly, this unexpected link to her former life. She agreed immediately, sensing that this exchange of knowledge could be important beyond the simple learning of letters. They began that evening in the new camp, Morning Dove joining them with eager attention as Kate pointed to letters and words, helping Running Fox and the girl begin to decode the marks that held meaning. As the summer progressed in the mountain camp, Kate found her place among the Apache becoming more defined and more complex. She was teacher and student, outsider and insider, a bridge between worlds whether she'd chosen that role or not. And as she taught Morning Dove English words and Running Fox's letters, she understood that the bonds being formed were changing everyone involved in ways that couldn't be undone. The summer storms came to the mountain camp with fury that shook the earth and turned the sky black as charcoal. Kate stood at the entrance of her wickiup watching lightning split the heavens, while thunder rolled through the valleys like the voices of angry gods. She'd been living among the Apache for nearly 4 months now, and the mountain camp had become more familiar to her than the settlement life she'd left behind. Her hands were strong and capable now, her skin bronzed by the high-altitude sun, her Apache vocabulary growing daily until she dreamed in a mixture of both languages. Morning Dove had become her constant companion and unofficial little sister, the child's attachment growing stronger with each passing week. The girl had taken to wearing her hair in a style that mimicked Kate's braids, had learned to read simple English words from the water-stained primer, and had appointed herself Kate's protector whenever Stone, Jaw, or the more suspicious members of the band cast doubtful glances in the white woman's direction. Gray Thunder watched this bond with what Kate thought might be approval, though the chief remained largely inscrutable in his dealings with her. The storm that raged this evening had driven everyone to shelter early, cutting short the daily routines of hunting and gathering that structured Apache life. Kate had spent the afternoon helping deer track, and 2 other women process a deer that hunters had brought in that morning, learning the precise cuts that separated meat from sinew, the careful scraping that would prepare the hide for tanning. Her knife work had improved dramatically, earning quiet nods of approval from women who 4 months ago had regarded her with open hostility. When the rain finally stopped near dusk, the camp emerged to find the world transformed and washed clean. The streams ran high and fast with runoff. The pine trees dripped crystal water from every needle, and the air smelled of wet earth and ozone. Morning Dove found Kate immediately, tugging at her hand and chattering excitedly about something Kate only partially understood. Running Fox appeared to translate, his English now significantly improved from their nightly reading lessons. "She says the storm has revealed a sacred place," Running Fox explained, his face showing unusual excitement. "A cave in the red cliffs where the ancient ones left their mark. Morning Dove wants to show you before the other children claim the discovery." Kate looked to White Rain for permission, and the old woman gave a curt nod. adding what Running Fox translated as a warning to be back before full darkness when mountain lions hunted. Kate followed Mourning Dove up a steep trail that wound through stands of pine and juniper. The ground slick with mud that made every step treacherous. The girl moved with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, occasionally looking back to make sure Kate kept pace. They climbed for perhaps 20 minutes until the trees thinned and revealed a wall of red sandstone streaked with desert varnish. The dark patina that centuries of water had painted on the rock. The cave opening was narrow, barely visible behind a curtain of water still dripping from the storm. Mourning Dove squeezed through with ease, her small body disappearing into darkness. Kate hesitated only a moment before following, her broader frame scraping against stone as she pushed through the entrance. Inside, the cave opened into a space perhaps 15 feet across, the ceiling high enough for Kate to stand upright. Light filtered through the entrance and several cracks in the rock above, illuminating what had excited Mourning Dove so much. The walls were covered in pictographs, ancient paintings in red and white and black pigments that depicted hunters and animals, celestial symbols and geometric patterns that suggested meanings Kate couldn't begin to interpret. Mourning Dove stood in the center of the cave with her hands raised reverently, speaking in Apache with a hushed voice that suggested she understood the sacred nature of this place. Kate moved slowly around the perimeter, studying the images that connected this moment to people who had lived and died centuries before she was born. One section of wall showed what appeared to be a story sequence. Stick figures engaged in some kind of conflict, followed by images that might have represented peace or alliance. Human figures with hands joined beneath a symbol that could have been the sun or perhaps a spiritual representation. Kate found herself deeply moved by these ancient attempts at communication, at preserving stories for those who would come after. Mourning Dove came to stand beside Kate, her small hand slipping into Kate's larger one. The girl spoke softly in Apache, then switched to careful English. The grandmothers say the old people knew things we forget. They say when worlds crash together like storm clouds, wise ones find the calm place between. Kate looked down at the child's upturned face. Struck by the depth of wisdom in one so young, they stayed in the cave perhaps half an hour. Mourning Dove showing Kate different paintings and sharing what stories she'd been taught about the ancient ones. When they finally emerged, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took Kate's breath away. They hurried back down the trail, arriving in camp just as White Rain was beginning to show signs of worry. That night around the central fire, Mourning Dove told the assembled people about the cave discovery, her animated description drawing interested murmurs from the elders. Gray Thunder questioned his daughter carefully about the exact location, then nodded with satisfaction. He spoke at length in Apache, his tone suggesting he was sharing history or legend. Running Fox, sitting near Kate, provided whispered translation. He says that cave was known to his grandfather's grandfather, a place where the people would go to seek visions and communicate with the spirit world. He says it is good that Mourning Dove found it again, that perhaps the spirits are telling us something important. He says the old ones who painted those walls knew both war and peace, knew times when different peoples had to learn to live side by side or all would perish. Running Fox's voice was thoughtful as he translated. Kate felt eyes turn toward her as Gray Thunder continued speaking, understanding that somehow she had become part of whatever point the chief was making. When he finished, White Rain added her voice, and though Kate couldn't follow all the words, she caught her own name and Mourning Dove's, caught references to the river rescue and the cave discovery. Whatever was being discussed, it concerned her directly. After the gathering dispersed, Running Fox approached Kate with an unusual expression, something between concern and excitement. Gray Thunder has made a decision, he said in English. He wants you to speak with a man who is coming to the camp tomorrow. A white man who trades with the Apache and sometimes carries messages between our people and the fort commanders. The chief thinks maybe you can help find words that prevent bloodshed. Kate felt her stomach tighten with apprehension and a strange sense of purpose. Why me? What does he think I can do that he cannot? Running Fox considered his answer carefully before responding. He says you know both worlds, speak both tongues. He says the traders and soldiers see Apache as savages. But they might listen to a white woman who chooses to live with us. Who can tell them we are people, not animals? The weight of this responsibility pressed on Kate as she lay in her wickiup that night. She thought about the wagon train she'd been traveling with, about the casual way the men had spoken of Indians as obstacles to be removed, threats to be eliminated. She thought about the Apache she'd come to know, their complex culture and deep connection to these lands, their fierce love of freedom and family. How could she possibly bridge the chasm between such different ways of seeing the world? The trader arrived mid-morning on a mule loaded with goods, accompanied by 2 Apache guides who'd met him at a prearranged location. His name was Jacob Henley, a weathered man of perhaps 50 with shrewd eyes and a beard gone mostly gray. He set up his trading items with practiced efficiency, displaying knives and blankets, coffee and sugar, ammunition and metal tools that the Apache valued highly. People from the camp came to examine his wares, to negotiate trades of hides and worked leather for the manufactured goods they couldn't produce themselves. Gray Thunder let the trading proceed for several hours before summoning both Henley and Kate to his wickiup. Stone Jaw was present as always, along with White Rain and 2 senior warriors whose names Kate had learned were Black Wolf and Stands Alone. Morning Dove sat quietly in the back, her dark eyes missing nothing. Henley looked surprised to see a white woman in Apache dress, his eyebrows rising as he took in Kate's transformed appearance. Jacob Henley. "This is Kate Brennan," Gray Thunder said in careful English he'd been practicing. "She lives with my people now. She speaks for me to you." Henley nodded slowly, his trader's instincts telling him not to show too much reaction. "Ma'am," he said simply, "I heard there was a captive woman with this band, but I understood she was being held for ransom." Kate replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "But circumstances changed. I'm here of my own choice now, and Chief Gray Thunder has asked me to help communicate his concerns about the increased settlement activity and army presence in this territory." She spoke formally, understanding that this conversation could have consequences far beyond this wickiup. What followed was a careful negotiation of words and meanings. Gray Thunder spoke in Apache, which Kate translated to English for Henley, who responded in English that Kate then translated back to Apache. The chief laid out his grievances, the broken promises of past treaties, the encroachment on hunting grounds, the unprovoked attacks on Apache camps by volunteer militia groups. He emphasized that his people wanted peace, but would defend themselves if pushed beyond endurance. Henley listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed his long experience dealing with Apache bands. "I can carry these concerns to Colonel Morrison at Fort Grant," he said finally. "But I'll be honest with you, Chief. The Colonel's under pressure from Washington to clear this territory for settlement. They're offering land grants to any man who'll homestead out here. And the Army's job is to make that safe for white families." Kate translated this, watching Gray Thunder's face remain impassive as he absorbed information he'd probably already suspected. The chief responded with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. What would it take to establish a boundary that both sides would respect? At least temporarily, to allow for coexistence rather than extermination. Henley scratched his beard thoughtfully. "That's above my authority, but I can propose it to the Colonel. Maybe if there was a defined hunting territory that settlers agreed to stay clear of, and if the Apache agreed not to raid wagon trains or settlements, there could be some kind of arrangement. It'd take the Apache sending representatives to the fort to negotiate. Under a flag of truce, the translation of this suggestion caused immediate debate among the Apache present. Stone Jaw spoke forcefully against any such meeting. citing multiple examples of truces that had ended in treachery and massacre. Black Wolf countered that avoiding all contact with the whites had not prevented the steady loss of Apache lands. The debate went back and forth, with Kate translating the key points for Henley, who listened with the patient air of a man who'd witnessed many such councils. Finally, Grey Thunder raised his hand for silence and spoke with measured authority. Kate translated, "The chief says he will send a delegation to Fort Grant, but with conditions. He wants safe passage guaranteed in writing by the fort commander. He wants the meeting to take place outside the fort walls, in a neutral location. And he wants Kate Brennan to accompany the delegation as witness and translator, because she knows both peoples and has no reason to deceive either side." Henley's eyes widened slightly at this last condition, and he studied Kate with new interest. "That's a lot to ask of the colonel, ma'am. You willing to do this? It could be dangerous if things go wrong." Kate felt every eye in the wiki up upon her, felt the weight of Morning Dove's gaze most of all. She thought about the pictographs in the cave, about ancient peoples who'd found ways to live alongside each other. She thought about the child who'd become like a sister to her, about White Rain's patient teaching and Running Fox's friendship. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "If it might prevent bloodshed and give these people a chance at survival, I'll do it." Grey Thunder nodded once, satisfaction crossing his usually stoic features. Henley agreed to carry the proposal to Fort Grant and return within 2 weeks with the colonel's response. The trader completed his business and departed, leaving the camp buzzing with speculation about what his mission might bring. The days that followed were tense with anticipation and preparation. Grey Thunder selected Stonejaw, Running Fox, and Black Wolf to accompany the delegation, choosing warriors who could demonstrate Apache strength while also showing restraint. White Rain worked with Kate on refining her Apache language skills, drilling her on the formal speech patterns used in negotiations. Morning Dove shadowed Kate constantly, her usual cheerfulness subdued by worry she couldn't quite articulate. One evening as Kate helped prepare the meal, Deer Track approached with unusual solemnity. Through a mixture of Apache and gestures, she conveyed a warning that Kate should be very careful at the fort, that white soldiers sometimes took women by force, that Kate's position between two worlds made her vulnerable to suspicion and violence from both sides. Kate thanked her for the concern, touched by this sign of genuine care from a woman who'd once regarded her as an enemy. Running Fox had become increasingly protective as well, spending time teaching Kate about Apache combat signs and escape routes. Information he shouldn't have been sharing but justified as necessary for her survival. "If things go bad at the fort," he told her one evening during their reading lesson, "you run for the rocks east of the meeting place. There are caves there where you can hide until we find you." His earnestness made Kate's throat tight with emotion. Morning Dove was the hardest to reassure. The child had nightmares about Kate being taken away by soldiers, would wake crying and calling for her in the darkness. Kate would go to the girl's sleeping place and hold her, stroking her hair and murmuring comfort in a blend of English and Apache. "I will come back," Kate promised. "I will always come back to you, little sister." The child would cling to her, needing the reassurance even if she couldn't entirely believe it. When Henley returned after 12 days, he brought a written response from Colonel Morrison, agreeing to the meeting. The colonel proposed a location called Cottonwood Springs, a half-day's ride from the fort, known to both Apache and soldiers as neutral ground. The meeting would take place in 5 days, with safe passage guaranteed for the Apache delegation. The colonel's letter specifically mentioned Kate by name, requesting her presence as translator and expressing curiosity about a white woman living voluntarily with the Apache. The night before the delegation was to depart, the entire camp gathered for a ceremony Kate didn't fully understand, but recognized as deeply spiritual. Grey Thunder spoke at length, calling on the spirits of ancestors to protect the travelers and guide their words. White Rain sang in a voice surprisingly strong for her age, a song that seemed to reach back through generations. Even Stone Jaw, usually so severe, showed signs of the weight this mission carried. Morning Dove gave Kate a small medicine pouch that White Rain had helped her prepare. Filled with herbs and a turquoise bead that was the child's most precious possession. "For protection," the girl said in English, her eyes swimming with tears she was trying not to shed. "You wear this, spirits watch over you." Kate tied the pouch around her neck, pulling Morning Dove into an embrace that said more than words could convey. As Kate lay in her wickiup that final night before departure, she understood that tomorrow would test everything she'd become over these months with the Apache. She was no longer entirely the woman who'd been captured on that wagon train, but neither was she Apache despite her dress and language skills. She existed in a liminal space between worlds, and tomorrow that space would either become a bridge that served both peoples, or a chasm that swallowed her whole. Sleep came late and fitfully, filled with dreams of painted caves and rushing rivers, of a little girl's laughter and the thunder of approaching storms. The delegation rode out at dawn with the mountain peaks casting long shadows across the valley floor. 5 riders moving in silence through terrain that shifted from pine, forest to scrub desert as they descended toward the meeting place. Kate rode between Running Fox and Black Wolf, her borrowed horse steady beneath her despite the tension she could feel radiating from every member of the group. Gray Thunder led with the bearing of a man riding toward either salvation or doom, while Stone Jaw brought up the rear, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape for signs of treachery. They reached Cottonwood Springs by mid-afternoon, the location living up to its name with ancient trees clustered around a reliable water source that had served travelers for centuries. The springs fed a small creek that wound through rocks worn smooth by time, creating natural seats and gathering spaces that suggested this had long been a neutral meeting ground for various peoples. No soldiers were visible yet, though Kate knew the fort was less than 3 hours' ride to the east. Gray Thunder called a halt in a defensive position on slightly elevated ground, with good sightlines in all directions. The horses were hobbled near water, but kept ready for quick mounting if necessary. Stone Jaw and Black Wolf took positions where they could watch the approach routes, their rifles across their laps in a posture that managed to be both ready and not overtly threatening. Running Fox stayed close to Kate, his young face showing the strain of responsibility beyond his years. "You are nervous," Gray Thunder observed, speaking to Kate in Apache as he checked the loads in his own rifle. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact. Kate nodded, seeing no point in denying what was obvious. "I fear I will fail you, that my words will not be enough to bridge the distance between your people and mine." The chief regarded her with his dark, unreadable eyes for a long moment before responding. "Words alone never bridge such distances," he said. "But they can build the first supports on which trust might eventually rest. You saved my daughter when you had no reason to care if an Apache child lived or died. That action spoke louder than any words. The soldiers will see in you what we have seen, someone who acts from the heart when the moment demands courage. That matters more than perfect translation." His faith in her was both comforting and terrifying. The sun had moved perhaps 2 hours across the sky when dust appeared on the eastern horizon, the telltale sign of riders approaching. Stone Jaw gave a low whistle that brought everyone to alert readiness, hands moving to weapons without actually raising them in threat. Kate felt her heart hammering as the distant dust resolved into a column of cavalry. Perhaps 20 soldiers riding in formation with a flag bearer carrying the stars and stripes at their head. The soldiers halted about 200 yards away, far enough to avoid seeming aggressive, but close enough that intentions were clear. An officer rode forward alone, his horse walking at a deliberate pace that suggested confidence rather than fear. He was a man in his 40s with a full beard shot through with gray, wearing captain's insignia and carrying no visible weapons beyond a holstered pistol. When he'd covered half the distance, Gray Thunder nudged his horse forward, gesturing for Kate to follow. They met in the open ground between the two groups. 3 riders forming a triangle of suspicion and possibility. The officer spoke first, his voice carrying the flat accent of somewhere far from this desert territory. "I'm Captain William Foster, representing Colonel Morrison of Fort Grant. I'm told you're Chief Grey Thunder, and that this woman serves as your translator." His eyes moved to Kate with unconcealed curiosity. "I am Grey Thunder," the chief responded in English that was heavily accented, but comprehensible. "This is Kate Brennan, who lives with my people and speaks both tongues with honest heart." Kate inclined her head in acknowledgement, very aware of how she must appear to the captain. A white woman in Apache dress with sun-darkened skin and hair worn in the style of the people she'd chosen to live among. "Mrs. Brennan," Foster said, his tone carefully neutral, "there are questions about your status and well-being that I'm obliged to address before we proceed with any other business. Are you being held against your will? Do you wish to return to your own people?" The directness of the question was both expected and still jarring. Kate took a breath before responding, knowing her answer would shape everything that followed. "I was captured during a raid 4 months ago, Captain Foster."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"My brother was killed and I was taken prisoner. That much is true." She saw Foster's hand move slightly toward his pistol and continued quickly. "But my status changed when I saved Chief Grey Thunder's daughter from drowning. I was given a choice to stay or leave with traders who visit the camp. I chose to stay. I am here now of my own free will, acting as translator because I believe both sides need someone who understands their perspectives if there's to be any hope of peace." Foster studied her face for signs of deception or coercion, his experienced eyes looking for the tells that might indicate she was speaking under duress. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly and shifted his attention back to Grey Thunder. "Very well. The Colonel authorized me to hear your concerns and to discuss possible terms for a temporary peace agreement. He wants me to make clear that he can't promise anything beyond Fort Grant's immediate territory, but he's willing to establish protocols that might prevent unnecessary bloodshed." What followed was a careful dance of diplomacy conducted in the shadow of recent violence and ancient grievances. Grey Thunder laid out the Apache position, with Kate translating his formal speech into English that captured both the meaning and the emotion behind the words. He spoke of broken treaties and stolen lands, of unprovoked attacks on peaceful camps and the slaughter of women and children by volunteer militia groups that the army did nothing to stop. He detailed the shrinking of Apache hunting territories as settlers claimed water sources and drove away game. Foster listened without interruption, his face revealing little of his thoughts. When Grey Thunder finished, the captain responded with equal formality, acknowledging the Apache grievances while explaining the political realities he operated within. The government had opened these territories for settlement, he said, and the Army's mandate was to make that settlement possible. But he personally believed that wholesale extermination served no one's interests. That controlled boundaries and clear agreements could benefit both sides. The Colonel is prepared to recognize a defined territory as Apache hunting grounds, Foster continued, with Kate translating for Grey Thunder. This would be a zone west of the Red Cliff Range, north of the Mexican border, approximately 3,000 square miles where Apache bands could move freely without interference. In exchange, he requires assurance that wagon trains and settlements east of that boundary will not be raided, and that Apache warriors will not attack Army patrols unless fired upon first. Grey Thunder conferred briefly with Stonejaw and Black Wolf, who had ridden up during the negotiations to hear the terms directly. Stonejaw's face showed deep skepticism, his scarred features twisted in barely contained anger as he pointed out that similar promises had been made and broken before. Black Wolf argued that 3,000 square miles was a fraction of the territory the Apache had traditionally controlled, that the boundaries being proposed cut them off from several sacred sites and important seasonal hunting grounds. Kate found herself in the uncomfortable position of translating arguments that she knew Captain Foster would find unacceptable. Watching his face harden as the objections multiplied, she understood both sides, could see the Apache perspective that they were being forced to accept crumbs of their own land, could equally see the military reality that Foster was already offering more than his superiors probably wanted him to concede. The gulf between the two positions seemed suddenly unbridgeable. "Captain Foster," Kate said, speaking for herself rather than translating, "what Chief Grey Thunder and his warriors are telling you is that this feels like another in a long series of agreements designed to diminish Apache territory until there's nothing left. They've seen boundaries redrawn whenever white settlers decide they want land that was supposed to be protected, without some guarantee that this boundary will actually be respected and enforced. They can't convince their people that agreement is anything but temporary surrender." Foster's jaw tightened, and for a moment Kate feared she'd overstepped, that he would dismiss her as an Apache sympathizer whose translation couldn't be trusted. But instead he nodded slowly and spoke with what sounded like genuine frustration. "You're not wrong, Mrs. Brennan. I can't guarantee that this boundary will hold forever because I know the history as well as you do. But I can guarantee that it will hold for at least 2 years. Because Colonel Morrison is being transferred to a post in the Dakota Territory in 24 months, and he wants his command here to end without major conflict on his record. That's practical politics, not noble principles, but it's real." Kate translated this with careful attention to nuance and saw something shift in Grey Thunder's expression. The honesty of Foster's admission seemed to carry more weight than elaborate promises would have. The chief spoke again, proposing modifications to the boundary that would include access to 2 specific spring sites that held spiritual significance for the Apache. Foster agreed to include those locations, pulling out a rough map and marking the adjustments with Kate's help in identifying the Apache names for various landmarks. They negotiated for another hour as the sun moved toward the western horizon, working through details of how violations would be addressed, how communication would be maintained between the fort and Apache bands, how disputes over hunting rights or water access would be arbitrated. It was exhausting work that required Kate to hold multiple threads of meaning in her mind while ensuring that both sides understood not just the words but the intentions behind them. Finally, as shadows grew long across the desert floor, they reached an agreement that both sides found acceptable, if not ideal. Foster would take the terms back to Colonel Morrison for final approval, with the expectation that a written treaty would be prepared within 2 weeks. Grey Thunder would gather the other Apache band leaders who operated in the territory to present the agreement and seek their participation. Another meeting would be held at Cottonwood Springs to sign the formal document. As they prepared to part, Foster addressed Kate one final time with an expression that mixed respect and concern. "Mrs. Brennan, I feel obliged to tell you that there are people at the fort and in the settlements who won't understand your choice to remain with the Apache. There are those who'll say you've betrayed your own kind, that you've been corrupted or turned savage. If you ever need protection or want to return to white society, you can send word through the traders and I'll personally guarantee your safe passage." Kate appreciated the offer, even as she knew she wouldn't take it. "Thank you, Captain Foster, but my place is with Grey Thunder's band now. They've shown me more humanity than I had any right to expect after being taken captive. Whatever people might say about my choices, I know I'm doing something that matters, trying to prevent the kind of violence that killed my brother and has killed too many on both sides." Foster nodded his understanding and turned his horse back toward his waiting soldiers. The Apache delegation watched until the cavalry column disappeared into the eastern dusk before allowing themselves to relax their vigilance. Grey Thunder spoke quietly to his warriors, his words earning nods of cautious approval, even from Stone Jaw. Running Fox grinned at Kate with barely suppressed excitement, his youth showing through the warrior facade he'd maintained during the negotiations. "You did well," he said in English. "Your words built a path where there was only emptiness before. They made camp at the springs rather than attempting to ride back to the mountains in darkness, building a small fire and sharing the food they'd brought." The tension that had gripped them all day slowly eased as they discussed what had transpired, analyzing Foster's words and weighing the likelihood that the agreement would hold. Stonejaw remained skeptical, but acknowledged that Grey Thunder had negotiated skillfully, obtaining more concessions than he'd expected. Black Wolf, who'd been largely silent during the meeting, spoke at length about the challenges of convincing other Apache leaders to accept the terms. Some bands had suffered more grievously at White Hands and would resist any agreement on principle, he warned. There was also the problem of young warriors eager to prove themselves in combat, who might see peace as cowardice rather than strategic wisdom. Grey Thunder listened carefully, clearly already thinking several steps ahead to the difficult diplomacy that awaited within his own people. As the fire died down and the others prepared for sleep, Kate sat looking at the stars scattered across the desert sky. So thick and bright they seemed close enough to touch. She thought about Morning Dove waiting back at the mountain camp, about White Rain's fierce protection and Deer Track's friendship, about the life she'd built in these months of captivity turned chosen belonging. She thought about Captain Foster's offer and the white society she'd left behind, about the piano lessons she used to give in Ohio, and the woman she'd been before violence and loss had stripped away everything familiar. "You are troubled by what the soldier captain said," Grey Thunder observed, appearing silently beside her as was his habit. Kate hadn't heard him approach, testament to the Apache ability to move like ghosts when they chose. She nodded, seeing no point in denying what he'd clearly already discerned. "He offered me a way back to my old life, reminded me that I could still choose that path if I wanted. Part of me wonders if I'm being foolish, staying with people who were my enemies, learning to live in ways so different from everything I knew." The chief settled onto a rock near her, his face illuminated by starlight and the faint glow of coals. "You speak of enemies, but I do not think you truly believe we are your enemies any longer. Just as I no longer see you as my enemy, despite your white skin and the wrongs your people have committed against mine. We are something more complicated now, something that has no easy name in either your language or mine." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "My daughter loves you as she loved her mother who died. White Rain says you have the heart of the people despite being born to different circumstances. Running Fox would follow you into battle if you asked, though he is too young to understand all that means. You have become woven into our band in ways that cannot easily be undone. If you chose to leave, we would respect that choice, but we would also feel the hole left by your absence. That is not nothing, Kate Brennan. That is family, even if it came about through strange paths." His words struck deep, bringing tears to Kate's eyes that she didn't try to hide. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly. "Afraid that the agreement will fail, that violence will come anyway, and I'll have to watch people I care about suffer or die. Afraid that I'm caught between two worlds and will never truly belong to either. Afraid that Morning Dove will be hurt because I couldn't protect her from what's coming." The confession left her feeling exposed but also strangely lighter. Grey Thunder was silent for a time, his gaze on the distant mountains that held his people and his sleeping daughter. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Fear is the price of love, Kate Brennan. You fear for Morning Dove because you love her. You fear the agreement's failure because you care about both peoples now and would see neither destroyed. This fear does not make you weak, it makes you fully human. The question is not how to escape the fear, but what you will do despite its presence." They sat together in companionable silence as the night deepened, two people from different worlds who'd found themselves aligned by circumstance and choice. Kate understood that tomorrow they would begin the journey back to the mountain camp. where she would have to face Morning Dove's questions and White Rain's scrutiny, where the whole band would want to know every detail of the negotiations. She understood that the agreement they'd forged today was fragile at best, likely to be tested by hotheads and cynics on both sides. But sitting there under the vast desert sky with Grey Thunder's quiet presence beside her, Kate also understood something else. She'd found purpose in this unlikely place, had become a bridge between peoples who desperately needed translation, not just of words, but of hearts and intentions. Whatever came next, whatever tests lay ahead, she would face them with the strength she'd discovered in these months of transformation. She was Kate Brennan, daughter of Ohio, widow of the war, sister to Thomas who fell defending their wagon, and now also sister to Morning Dove, student of White Rain, friend to Running Fox, and voice for Grey Thunder's people. The contradictions in that identity no longer felt like weaknesses, but like the complex truth of who she'd become. Someone whose very existence argued that understanding between hostile peoples was possible if the will existed to try. As she finally lay down to sleep with her head on her saddle and the medicine pouch, Morning Dove had given her warm against her skin. Kate felt something settle in her chest that might have been peace or might have been the acceptance of a difficult calling. Either way, she slept without dreams until dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Morning Dove saw them first, her sharp young eyes spotting the returning delegation, while they were still distant specks against the mountain backdrop. The child's cry of joy echoed through the camp, bringing people rushing from their wickiups to watch the riders approach. Kate could see the girl jumping and waving with unrestrained excitement, her concern of the past days dissolving into pure relief that Kate had returned as promised. White Rain stood with her arms crossed, her weathered face betraying nothing. But Kate had learned to read the old woman's subtle tells and recognized the easing of tension in her shoulders. The delegation rode into questions shouted from every direction, people crowding close to hear news of the meeting with the soldiers. Grey Thunder raised his hand for silence and announced that a full council would be held after the evening meal, that all would hear the details then. Morning Dove ignored protocol and ran straight to Kate as she dismounted, throwing her arms around Kate's waist with such force it nearly knocked her backwards. The child was speaking rapidly in a mixture of Apache and English, half laughing and half crying, pressing her face against Kate's dusty dress as if to confirm through physical contact that this was real. Kate knelt to embrace the girl properly, feeling Morning Dove's small body trembling with emotion. "I told you I would come back, little sister," she murmured in Apache, stroking the child's hair. "Did you doubt my promise?" Morning Dove pulled back just enough to look at Kate with eyes that held a wisdom beyond her 8 years. "I believed, but I was still afraid. White Rain says we can believe and fear at the same time. That both can be true together." Kate smiled at this evidence of the old woman's teaching and pulled the girl close again. White Rain approached and placed a gnarled hand on Kate's shoulder, speaking quietly in Apache. "You look tired but not broken, which means things went better than Stone Jaw predicted. Come, you need food and rest before the council." Morning Dove let her breathe. The girl reluctantly released her grip, but stayed close to Kate's side as they walked toward the wickiup that had become Kate's home. Deer Track and several other women had prepared a meal, their gesture of welcome speaking louder than words about how Kate's status in the community had evolved. Kate ate gratefully while White Rain tended to minor scrapes and bruises from the journey, applying her medicinal pastes with practiced efficiency. Morning Dove sat pressed against Kate's side, occasionally touching her arm or hand as if to reassure herself of Kate's continued presence. The child asked endless questions about the journey, about the soldiers, about Captain Foster and what he looked like and whether he seemed like a good man or a bad one. Kate answered patiently, understanding that Morning Dove was processing her fears through curiosity. As the sun began its descent toward evening, the camp gathered around the central fire in numbers that suggested people from neighboring, Wickiups had arrived to hear the council. Gray Thunder stood with his senior warriors behind him, Stonejaw and Black Wolf, flanking him like pillars of authority. Running Fox took his place among the younger warriors, his posture showing new confidence earned through participation in important tribal business. Kate sat in a position of honor near the chief, with Mourning Dove stubbornly refusing to leave her side despite her father's meaningful glances. Gray Thunder began with formal acknowledgement of the ancestors and the spirits that watched over the people, then launched into a detailed account of the meeting at Cottonwood Springs. He described Captain Foster's demeanor in words, the terms proposed, and the negotiations that followed. Kate found herself called upon to clarify certain points, to translate specific phrases that lost meaning in Apache, to explain the white perspective on various compromises. The assembled people listened with intense focus, occasionally murmuring questions or comments that Gray Thunder addressed as they arose. When the chief finished outlining the agreement, he opened the discussion to the council members and respected elders. An old warrior named Broken Lance spoke first, his voice cracked with age but still carrying authority. He expressed doubt that any agreement with the whites would last longer than morning frost and summer sun, citing treaties made with his grandfather's generation that had dissolved like smoke when gold was discovered, or when settlers wanted particular lands. His skepticism resonated with many present, heads nodding in agreement. Stonejaw rose next and surprised Kate by offering qualified support for the agreement, despite his earlier reservations. The soldier captain spoke more honestly than most whites I have encountered, he said, his scarred face grave in the firelight. He did not promise what he could not deliver, did not speak of permanent peace when he knew that was impossible. He gave us 2 years of breathing space, and if we are wise, we will use that time to prepare for whatever comes after. We can hunt freely, rebuild our strength, perhaps convince other bands to join in common cause. His practical assessment carried weight with the more pragmatic members of the council. White Rain added her voice in support, pointing out that Kate's presence as translator had ensured both sides understood the true meaning behind the words, not just the surface meanings that could be twisted later. She has no reason to deceive either people, the old woman argued. She speaks with straight tongue because her heart is divided between both worlds. This makes her the right person to carry messages when messages must be carried. Several women voiced agreement, and Kate felt the burden of that trust settle more heavily on her shoulders. The debate continued for hours as various speakers rose to share their perspectives, some supporting the agreement as the best option available, others arguing for continued resistance regardless of the cost. A young warrior named Swift Arrow stood and spoke passionately about honor and the warrior's path, suggesting that accepting boundaries drawn by whites was tantamount to admitting defeat. His words stirred the younger men, but the elders countered with hard wisdom about the difference between honorable death and survival of the people. Gray Thunder finally brought the discussion to a close by calling for a decision. He framed the choice starkly. They could accept the agreement and use the promised 2 years to strengthen their position and build alliances, or they could reject it and face immediate intensification of military pressure with no guarantees of support from other Apache bands. He reminded them that winter was coming, that their supplies would be tested, that warfare in the cold months favored those who had permanent shelters and steady food sources. The choice, he said, was between difficult compromise and certain suffering. The council voted to accept the agreement with the understanding that representatives would be sent to other Apache bands to explain the terms and seek their participation. Gray Thunder would lead a delegation to the treaty signing at Cottonwood Springs in 2 weeks, and Kate would again serve as translator. The decision was met with mixed emotions, relief from some and resignation from others. But it was made and would be honored unless the whites violated the terms first. As the gathering dispersed, Running Fox approached Kate with unusual seriousness. "I have been thinking about the reading lessons and the letter shapes you have taught me. he said in his improving English. If we are to have peace with the whites, even temporary peace, more of our people should learn their language and their ways of marking words on paper. Will you teach others as you have taught me and Morning Dove? Kate agreed immediately, recognizing the wisdom in his thinking. Over the following days, Kate found herself with a growing group of students, mostly younger people but including some adults who saw practical value in understanding the white world. She conducted lessons using the water-stained primer and other materials that traders brought, teaching basic reading and writing while also sharing information about white customs and ways of thinking. Morning Dove appointed herself assistant teacher, demonstrating her own skills with pride and helping other children master sounds that came more naturally to her. White Rain observed these lessons with approval, occasionally sitting in to learn some English phrases herself despite her advanced age. Knowledge is power, the old woman said through Kate's translation at one session. The whites have power partly because they can communicate across distances with their marks on paper, can preserve their knowledge beyond the memory of one person. If we are to survive in a world increasingly dominated by their ways, we must learn what gives them strength. Her endorsement helped overcome resistance from more traditional members of the community. The 2 weeks before the treaty signing passed with a mixture of preparation and tension. Hunters brought in extra game to smoke and preserve for winter. Women worked long hours tanning hides and making clothing. Warriors practiced with their weapons while also drilling in the protocols they would follow at the formal meeting. Kate helped prepare a gift bundle to present to Colonel Morrison, items of craftsmanship that would demonstrate Apache skill and culture. Finely worked leather, beaded moccasins, a bow of remarkable quality. These gifts carried messages of goodwill but also of competence and dignity. Morning Dove grew anxious as the departure date approached, her old fears about Kate leaving resurfacing despite reassurances. The girl began having nightmares again, waking in the darkness calling for Kate, who would come and hold her until the child's trembling stopped. One night as they sat together watching the fire die to embers, Morning Dove asked the question that had been building in her heart. If you could go back to your people and never come back, would you? Her voice was small and frightened. Kate took a long time answering, wanting to give the child honesty rather than easy comfort. There are things about my old life that I miss, she said carefully in Apache. My brother Thomas, the music I used to play, certain foods and customs. But I cannot go back to being who I was before, even if I return to live among whites. What happened to me here, what you and your people have taught me, has changed me in ways that cannot be undone. You are my sister now in my heart, and sisters do not abandon each other. I will stay as long as you need me, as long as your people will have me. Morning Dove absorbed these words in silence, then nodded and finally slept. The expanded delegation that rode to Cottonwood Springs for the treaty signing included not just Gray, Thunder's representatives but envoys from 2 other Apache bands who'd agreed to be bound by the agreement. This larger group required more careful coordination, more attention to the politics and pride of multiple leaders who were allies but also sometimes rivals. Kate found herself navigating not just the gap between Apache and white perspectives, but also the subtle differences in how various Apache groups approached negotiation. Captain Foster was waiting with Colonel Morrison when they arrived. The colonel proving to be a stern-faced man in his 50s with hard eyes that suggested long experience on the frontier. He had brought a clerk to record the proceedings and create the written treaty document, along with an interpreter of his own to verify Kate's translations. This interpreter was a Mexican man named Carlos who'd lived among various Apache bands and spoke their language with reasonable fluency, his presence adding another layer of complexity to the communication. The formal ceremony was more elaborate than the initial negotiation, with both sides engaging in speeches that established their positions for the official record. Colonel Morrison spoke about the government's desire for peace, while emphasizing the strength of the army and the inevitability of white settlement. Gray Thunder and the other Apache leaders responded with their own formal statements, acknowledging the agreement while making clear it was accepted under duress. A temporary accommodation to overwhelming force rather than surrender of their claims to ancestral lands. Kate translated back and forth, with Carlos occasionally interjecting clarifications or alternative phrasings, the two of them working out the nuances that satisfied both sides. She found herself not just translating words but negotiating meanings, finding formulations that preserved each side's dignity while establishing common understanding. It was exhausting work that required absolute concentration. Any mistake or misunderstanding potentially unraveling the careful consensus they'd built. The written treaty was produced on formal paper with official seals. The English text read aloud, with Kate translating each paragraph for the Apache leaders' approval. The boundaries were described using landmarks that both sides recognized. The terms of the agreement laid out with clarity that left little room for later dispute about intentions. Colonel Morrison and Gray Thunder both signed the document, followed by the other band leaders. Their marks carefully witnessed and recorded by the clerk. As the ceremony concluded, Morrison addressed Kate directly for the first time. "Mrs. Brennan, I want to acknowledge your role in making this agreement possible. Captain Foster speaks highly of your integrity and your commitment to honest translation despite your unusual position. I'm told you could have chosen to remain with your own people, but elected to stay with the Apache. That's an uncommon decision that I admit I don't fully understand. But I respect it." His words were formal but carried an edge of genuine curiosity. Kate met his gaze steadily, aware that everyone present was listening to her response. "Colonel Morrison, I made a choice to stay with people who showed me mercy when they could have shown me cruelty, who welcomed me when they could have rejected me, who trusted me with their children's education and their most important negotiations. I hope this agreement holds, because I care about people on both sides of the line you've drawn today. My unusual position, as you call it, gives me perspective that I intend to use for as long as it might serve the cause of peace." Morrison nodded slowly and offered no further comment. The journey back to the mountain camp was lighter in spirit than the outward trip. The successfully completed treaty lifting a burden of uncertainty that had weighed on everyone. The other Apache leaders departed toward their own territories, with promises to communicate regularly and to jointly address any violations of the agreement. Gray Thunder spoke at length with Kate about the challenges ahead. The need to ensure their own young warriors honored the terms. The importance of maintaining communication with the fort. They arrived at the mountain camp in late afternoon to find the entire community gathered in welcome. People lined along the trail calling greetings and questions. Morning Dove broke from the crowd and ran to meet them, her face alight with joy and relief. She grabbed Kate's leg as she dismounted, chattering about everything that had happened in camp during the absence, about lessons she'd practiced with the primer, about a fox she'd seen near the creek. The normalcy of the child's concerns felt like a gift after days of weighty diplomacy. That evening's council was celebratory rather than anxious. People gathering to hear the details of the treaty signing and to mark the occasion with food and stories. Gray Thunder presented Kate with a gift the community had prepared in her absence, a beautifully worked deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken many hands many hours to create. White Rain explained that each woman in the camp had contributed to the work, that the patterns included symbols representing Kate's journey from captive to translator to honored member of the band. Kate accepted the gift with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the symbolism and the care it represented. She tried to express her gratitude in Apache, stumbling over words made difficult by emotion, but the people understood. They saw in her tears the recognition of what they were offering, not just a garment, but full acceptance. Not just tolerance of her presence, but celebration of what she had become to them. As the celebration continued into the night with drumming and dancing, Kate found herself sitting with White Rain and Mourning Dove, watching the firelight play across faces of people who had become her family through the strangest of paths. The old woman spoke quietly in Apache, her words meant for Kate alone. "You came to us as an enemy, stayed as a prisoner, became one of the people through courage and choice. That is a powerful story, one that will be told to children not yet born. You have shown that the lines between peoples are not as solid as we sometimes believe, that hearts can learn new languages when circumstances demand it." Mourning Dove, drowsy from excitement and late hours, leaned against Kate's side with the trust of a child who knows herself absolutely safe. Kate wrapped an arm around the girl, feeling the steady breathing of the little life she'd saved from the rapids months ago. The life that had somehow saved her in return by giving her purpose and connection when she'd lost everything else. The circle of cause and effect seemed complete in this moment. The desperate swim to save a drowning child having led to this place of belonging she never could have anticipated. In the days that followed, life in the camp settled into new routines shaped by the treaty's existence. Hunting parties ranged freely through the agreed territory without fear of army interference, bringing back game that was dried and stored for the coming winter. The teaching sessions Kate conducted grew larger as more people recognized the value of understanding the white world. Messages arrived periodically through traders, confirming that the fort was honoring its commitments, that settlers were being warned away from Apache lands, that the fragile peace was holding. Kate received a letter from her uncle in Austin, forwarded through Captain Foster's good offices, expressing shock at learning she was alive and greater shock at her choice to remain with the Apache. He urged her to reconsider, to return to civilization and the protection of family. Kate wrote back carefully, explaining that she had found a different kind of family, that she was doing important work as a bridge between hostile peoples, that she could not abandon those who depended on her. She didn't know if he would understand, but she felt the need to try. Winter came to the mountains with heavy snows that tested the preparations the community had made. The wickiups proved warm and secure, the stores of dried meat and gathered plants adequate to carry them through the lean months. Kate learned winter skills she'd never needed in her old life: how to weave snowshoes from willow branches, how to track animals through fresh snow, how to preserve body heat during the coldest nights. Mourning Dove was her constant companion and sometimes teacher, the child's laughter echoing through the winter camp like a promise that spring would come again. On a particularly cold night when the wind howled through the pine trees and stars glittered like ice chips in the black sky, Gray Thunder visited Kate's wickiup with Running Fox as translator for concepts that required more English than the chief possessed. "I have been thinking about what happens when the 2 years of the treaty expire," he began without preamble. "Colonel Morrison will be gone. New commanders will not feel bound by agreements they did not make. The settlers will push for more land. The army will be ordered to give it to them. The cycle will begin again." Kate nodded, having thought the same thing many times during the long winter evenings. "What can be done to change that pattern?" she asked, though she suspected the answer was nothing, that they had bought time but not solved the fundamental problem. Gray Thunder was silent for a long moment, his face shadowed in the dim light of the fire. When he spoke, his words carried a weight of acceptance she'd rarely heard from him. "Perhaps nothing can stop what is coming," he admitted. "The whites are too many, their desire for land too great, their weapons too powerful. But maybe the 2 years we have gained can be used to prepare our people for a different kind of survival. Not survival through warfare, which grows more impossible with each passing season, but survival through adaptation. Learning their language, understanding their ways, finding how to exist in the world they are creating, because we cannot prevent its creation." The words clearly cost him. This acknowledgement of a future so different from the free life his people had always known. Kate felt her throat tighten with emotion, understanding what he was really saying. He was asking her to help prepare the Apache for a future that none of them wanted, but that he had the wisdom to see was inevitable. "You want me to teach more than just reading and writing," she said slowly. "You want me to help bridge the gap in understanding so that your people can survive what's coming, even if survival means profound change." Gray Thunder nodded once, his dark eyes holding hers. "Mourning Dove and the children of her generation will live in a world we cannot fully imagine," he said quietly. "They will need tools we never needed, knowledge we never possessed. You can give them those tools, that knowledge, because you stand between both worlds and understand what each requires. This is my request. Stay with us not just through the 2 years of the treaty, but beyond. Help my people find their way through the transformation that is coming. Be the bridge for as long as bridges are needed." The responsibility implicit in his words was staggering, yet Kate found herself nodding acceptance before she'd fully processed what she was agreeing to. "I will stay," she said simply. "I will teach what I know and learn what I must to help Mourning Dove and all the children navigate the world that's coming. This is my place now for better or worse, and I will not abandon it." Gray Thunder reached across and gripped her forearm in the Apache gesture of solemn agreement, then left her alone with her thoughts and the crackling fire. Spring returned to the mountains as it always did. Snow melting into rushing streams, wildflowers carpeting the meadows. New life stirring throughout the awakening land. The second year of the treaty began with continued peace, though reports from traders suggested tensions were building as settlers grew bolder and some Apache warriors grew restless with the restrictions. Kate expanded her teaching efforts, working with both children and adults, preparing them as best she could for the changes she knew were coming. Mourning Dove had grown taller over the winter, her childish roundness giving way to the early signs of the young woman she would become. She was Kate's star pupil, reading English with increasing fluency, writing letters that captured complex thoughts, asking questions that showed she understood the implications of living between two worlds. The girl had begun serving as assistant translator when traders came to camp, her bilingual abilities making her valuable to the community. One warm afternoon, as Kate and Mourning Dove sat by the creek practicing writing, the girl asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. "When I am grown, will there still be Apache lands where we can live free?" Her voice was matter-of-fact, not seeking false comfort, but real answer. Kate set down the stick she'd been using to mark letters in the dirt and looked at the child who'd become her sister. The child whose life she'd saved and who had saved hers in return. "I don't know what the future holds, little sister," Kate answered honestly. "But I know that you are smart and strong, that you can learn to live in whatever world emerges. The Apache people will survive because they've always survived, adapting to new circumstances while holding on to what matters most. And I will be here beside you, helping you navigate whatever comes. For as long as you need me." Mourning Dove smiled and returned to her writing practice, apparently satisfied with an answer that promised presence rather than certainty. As the sun moved toward evening and shadows lengthened across the mountain meadow, Kate watched the girl work with the primer, watched her form English letters with the same careful attention she applied to everything. She thought about the improbable journey that had brought her to this moment, from captive to translator to teacher to something that transcended simple categories. She thought about the treaty that still held but would inevitably expire, about the changes coming whether anyone wanted them or not. But mostly she thought about the morning she'd plunged into the rapids to save a drowning child. The instant when instinct had overridden everything else and changed the course of her life forever. That single act of courage had opened a door between worlds, had shown that enemies could become family when circumstances demanded it, had proven that understanding across seemingly unbridgeable divides was possible if people were willing to try. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever tests the future held, Kate knew she'd made the right choice in that moment and every moment since. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers as Kate and Morning Dove walked back to camp together. The girl chattering about her lessons and her dreams. The woman listening with the attention of someone who knew that these moments were precious and finite. Behind them, the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Ahead, the cooking fires of the camp beckoned them home. And in the space between past and future, Kate walked with quiet certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Doing exactly what she was meant to do, for as long as the story lasted. The autumn wind carried the scent of change across the Arizona territory as Kate stood at the edge of Cottonwood Springs, watching dust rise from the road that now connected Fort Grant to the expanding settlements beyond. 3 years had passed since she'd first been brought to these lands as a captive. 1 year since the treaty signing that had promised 2 years of peace. That promise had held longer than many expected, but now the signs of its approaching end were everywhere. Morning Dove sat beside Kate on the smooth rocks. No longer the 8-year-old child who'd nearly drowned, but a girl of 9 approaching 10. Tall for her age and carrying herself with dignity that reflected both her father's leadership and Kate's teaching. The girl's English was now nearly flawless. Her reading and writing skills surpassing many white children her age. Her understanding of both Apache and settler cultures, giving her a perspective rare among her people. The trader said Colonel Morrison has already left for the Dakota Territory, Morning Dove observed, her dark eyes tracking a distant wagon train. He said the new commander believes all Indians should be on reservations or dead. Her voice was calm, the voice of someone who'd learned to face hard truths without flinching. Kate nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was likely coming. Captain Foster still commands at the fort, and he's a good man who'll honor the treaty as long as he's able. But the new colonel will have different priorities. The question isn't whether conflict will come, but when. And how your people can survive it. They'd come to meet Jacob Henley, the trader who'd become a crucial link between the Apache bands and the outside world. Gray Thunder arrived with Running Fox and Stone Jaw, their faces grim in ways that suggested bad news beyond what they'd come to hear. We found the remains of a camp burned 3 days ago, Gray Thunder said without preamble. A small band that refused the treaty, tried to live in the old ways. The soldiers killed everyone, even the children. This is what comes when the treaty ends. Kate felt Morning Dove stiffen against her side, but the girl said nothing. Her face carefully neutral. Henley arrived within the hour, his face carrying none of his usual jovial greeting. I won't soften this, he said once they'd gathered in the shade. The new commander, Colonel Blackwell, has orders to clear all Apache from this territory within 6 months. The government's offering reservation lands in New Mexico, about a fifth the size of what the treaty promised. Any bands that refuse will be hunted down and destroyed. Gray Thunder's face remained impassive, but Kate saw his hands clench briefly. What about the treaty? Kate asked, though she already knew the answer. Henley shook his head sadly. Blackwell says it's void under current territorial policy. The agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on. Gray Thunder spoke in Apache, and Morning Dove translated for Henley. My father says he will call a council of all the bands. He says some will choose to fight, but he will argue for moving to the reservation because survival matters more than pride. He asks if you will help negotiate better terms to ensure promises are kept this time. Kate felt the enormity of what was being asked. Looking at Morning Dove's face, at the trust in the girl's eyes, at Gray Thunder's quiet dignity, Kate knew her answer had never been in doubt. I'll help however I can, she said simply. I'll go to the reservation if that's where you go, continue teaching the children, advocate for better conditions. This isn't the future we hoped for, but it's the reality we face. Morning Dove and the other children deserve adults who'll fight for their survival. Gray Thunder nodded once, then mounted his horse and rode back toward camp with his warriors. Henley looked at Kate with concern. You know what you're choosing? Once you go to the reservation with them, there's no coming back to white society. My own kind are the people who've become my family, Kate replied quietly, pulling Mourning Dove close. Those who need me most, who gave me purpose when I'd lost everything. Whatever comes next, I'll walk it with them. Henley nodded slowly and rode away, leaving Kate and Mourning Dove alone. As the sun descended toward the western mountains, Kate thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd jumped into deadly rapids to save a drowning child 3 years ago, and that single act had set everything in motion. Now she was preparing to jump again into an uncertain future on an Apache reservation. Mourning Dove looked up at Kate with eyes that still held hope. Will you tell me a story tonight about your life before, about the music you played and the place called Ohio? Kate smiled at the request. I'll tell you about my mother's piano and about the river where my father taught me to swim. And then tomorrow we'll begin preparing for whatever comes next. Because that's what survivors do. They walked back toward the mountain camp as darkness fell, 2 figures moving through the twilight, bound by love and choice, and the understanding that family was not always what you were born into, but sometimes what you chose, despite impossible circumstances. Behind them, Cottonwood Springs whispered its eternal song, and ahead the campfires beckoned them home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.